There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when someone is caught being wrong. And instead of softening, they harden. You felt it, that strange chill, the air going still. Like the truth itself became something dangerous to hold. Maybe you've sat across from someone like this. A parent, a partner, a friend who would rather burn the whole conversation down than say two simple words, "I was wrong." And maybe in some quiet, uncomfortable corner of yourself, you've wondered if you are that person too, not because you're cruel, but because something in you flinches at the very idea of fault, the way skin flinches from fire. This isn't really about facts. Facts are easy. Anyone can be corrected on a date, a name, a small detail, and shrug it off without a second thought. What this is really about runs deeper than facts. It lives in identity. Not in what someone did, but in who they believe they are. And when those two things collide, when evidence says one thing and self-image says another, something ancient and protective wakes up inside them. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable buzz you feel when two beliefs can't both be true at the same time. I am a good person. I hurt someone, both can't sit peacefully in the same mind without friction. So the mind, desperate for relief, does what minds do best. It rewrites the story. Not because the person is lying to you, because they are lying gently, desperately to themselves first. Think about that for a second, not malice, self-preservation. There's a softness hidden underneath all that hardness if you look closely enough. The person who can never admit fault isn't usually arrogant in the way people assume, overflowing with confidence, untouchable, certain. More often they are the opposite, brittle. Tender in places they've learned to armor over. Their certainty isn't strength. It's scaffolding around something that feels, to them, dangerously close to collapse. Picture a house built on a foundation that was never quite steady, maybe a childhood where mistakes were met not with patience, but with punishment, withdrawal, ridicule, silence. A child who spills milk and is screamed at learns something far more dangerous than "don't spill milk." They learn that mistakes mean danger. That mistakes mean love disappears. That mistakes mean becoming something unlovable. That child grows up. The milk is no longer milk, it's a missed deadline, a hurtful comment, a broken promise, but the nervous system doesn't know the difference. It still rings the same old alarm. Admitting wrongness to a person wired this way doesn't feel like a small correction. It feels like a small death, not of ego, of safety itself. This is where attachment theory quietly enters the room. Attachment theory simply describes how the bonds formed in our earliest years shape how we love, fight, and connect for the rest of our lives. If an early world taught warmth in response to mistakes, a gentle, "it's okay, let's fix it," the nervous system learns that being wrong is survivable. But if that early world answered mistakes with anger or withdrawal or shame, the body learns a very different lesson. Admitting fault is not safe here. So when someone refuses to apologize, what you're often witnessing isn't stubbornness. It's an old nervous system still protecting a much younger version of them. A 6-year-old wearing a 36-year-old's face, not defiance. A flashback wearing the costume of confidence. Here's a contrast worth sitting with. It's not pride, it's fear. It's not arrogance, it's fragility wearing armor. It's not control over you, it's a desperate grasp at control over themselves. Because somewhere along the way, being wrong got tangled up with being worthless, and no one ever untangled the knot. Maybe you know someone whose locus of control sits almost entirely outside themselves, meaning when something goes wrong, their mind automatically searches for someone else to blame, because the alternative, looking inward, feels unbearable. This isn't a moral failing so much as an exhausted coping mechanism, worn smooth from overuse, like a path walked so many times the grass simply stopped growing there. Here's something tender to consider. Admitting fault requires a kind of internal safety not everyone was given. To say "I was wrong," you have to believe somewhere underneath the words that you will still be loved afterward, that your worth isn't conditional on your perfection. For some people, that belief was built early and gently. For others, it was never built at all. So how could they offer you something they were never given themselves? Have you ever noticed how the people who apologize easily are often the ones who feel safest in their relationships, not because they're more evolved, not because they're better people, but because somewhere inside them lives a quiet certainty: I can mess up and still be held. That certainty is rare. It's almost sacred when you think about it. The simple, radical safety of believing your mistakes won't cost you the people you love. Contrast that with the person who cannot say sorry. For them, an apology doesn't feel like accountability. It feels like exposure. It feels like handing someone a weapon and trusting them not to use it. And if their history has taught them that people do use it, that vulnerability gets punished, then of course they keep the weapon locked away. Of course they'd rather argue the unwinnable argument than risk the unbearable softness of admitting they got it wrong. There's also a quieter, less talked about piece of this, the brain's relationship with being right. Being correct, validated, agreed with lights up the brain's reward pathways, releasing small hits of dopamine, the chemical tied to pleasure and motivation. Being wrong, especially publicly, does something closer to the opposite. It can trigger something resembling a threat response, the same ancient alarm system that once kept the body alive in front of predators, now firing off over something as small as a misremembered fact in a group chat. The body doesn't always know the difference between a real danger and an emotional one. To the nervous system, shame can feel like teeth. This is not an excuse, it's an explanation. There's a difference and it matters. Because here's the harder truth, the one worth sitting with for a moment, understanding why someone can't admit fault doesn't mean you have to keep absorbing the damage of it. You can hold compassion for their wounded inner child and still protect your own peace. You can understand the root and still refuse to keep watering it with your patience, your apologies, your endless emotional labor done on their behalf. Empathy isn't a debt you owe people who hurt you. It's a lens, not a leash. Maybe you've spent years being the one who says sorry first, every single time, even when you weren't entirely sure you were wrong. Just to keep the peace, just to stop the silence, just to avoid becoming the reason the room went cold. If that's you, ask yourself gently, when did you learn that peace was your job to maintain? When did I'm sorry become less of an apology and more of a survival skill? This is the part where it gets layered, because not all refusal to admit fault looks the same. Some of it is loud, defensive, combative, the kind that turns a small disagreement into a courtroom. Some of it is quiet, the silent treatment, the subject change, the slow walking away from any conversation that gets too close to accountability. Loud or quiet, the root is often the same. A person who has never learned that being wrong and being worthless are two entirely different things. It's not stubbornness, it's terror wearing stubbornness as a disguise. It's not coldness, it's a nervous system that learned warmth disappears the moment you slip up. It's not control, it's the desperate architecture someone built to keep themselves from feeling, even for 1 second, like the unlovable child they were once made to believe they were. And yet, here's a nuance worth approaching from another angle. Not everyone who struggles to apologize had a painful childhood. Sometimes this pattern is simply learned from a culture, a family, a particular era that praised certainty over reflection, that mistook stubbornness for strength, that taught entire generations softness was weakness and admitting fault was defeat. Sometimes it isn't trauma at all. Sometimes it's just inheritance, values passed down like an old coat that never quite fit, worn anyway because no one ever offered a different one. There's also a difference worth naming gently between shame and guilt because they shape this so differently. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am something bad. Guilt is workable, you can apologize, repair, move forward. Shame is suffocating. There's no fixing a person, only a behavior, but shame convinces someone that they themselves are the broken thing. People who struggle the most with admitting fault often live in shame's house, not guilt's, and shame doesn't invite repair. Shame invites hiding. So when you watch someone deflect, dismiss, deny, rewrite history right in front of your eyes, try just for a moment to see the hiding underneath it. Not to excuse it, just to understand it. There's a strange kind of grief in watching someone protect a version of themselves that isn't even real, defending a story instead of living a truth, because the truth to them once felt like annihilation. What would it take, do you think, for someone like that to finally feel safe enough to say those three small words, I was wrong, without their whole identity crumbling in the process? Maybe it would take a relationship somewhere sometime where mistakes were met with steadiness instead of punishment. Maybe it would take one person, just one, who didn't flinch, didn't withdraw, didn't turn the moment into ammunition, who simply said, okay, now we fix it, and meant it. Healing rarely arrives in dramatic confrontations. More often it arrives slowly, in the accumulation of small, undramatic moments where being wrong didn't cost someone everything. Not collapse, a homecoming, the strange, quiet relief of discovering that fault doesn't have to mean exile. There's something unfiltered about a person who can finally say, I was wrong without flinching. No performance, no defense, just the plain, naked truth standing in the room without armor and somehow still standing. That moment isn't weakness. It's one of the most courageous things a nervous system can ever learn to survive. This is not, in the end, a story about who is right. It's a story about who feels safe enough to be human, flawed, fallible, occasionally foolish, and still worthy of love on the other side of it. The people who cannot admit fault are not monsters. They are often just unhealed, carrying an old wound dressed up as an opinion, an old fear dressed up as an argument, an old child dressed up as someone twice their age, still waiting for someone to say it's okay, still waiting for proof that mistakes don't mean disappearance. Not weakness, an old wound speaking in a stranger's voice. Not arrogance, armor grown so familiar it forgot it was ever armor at all. Not a flaw in their character, a fracture in their history, quietly running the show from somewhere behind the curtain. You carry your own version of this too somewhere. Everyone does. There is some sentence, some small moment that you have rewritten in your own memory just enough to survive it more comfortably. Not because you're dishonest. Because you're human, and humans protect themselves the way water finds the lowest point, instinctively, without always meaning to. It's not deception, it's the overflow of an old fear looking for somewhere safe to land. Maybe the real question isn't why certain people can never admit they're wrong. Maybe it's softer than that. Maybe it's asking what happened to them long before you ever met them that made being wrong feel like the most dangerous thing in the world. And maybe in some quiet corner of a quiet room, in the hum that settles after an argument has finally gone still, there's room for something gentler than blame. Not approval. Not forgiveness, even not yet. Just the soft, aching recognition that everyone you've ever met carries worlds within them, entire histories of being hurt, being missed, being misunderstood. And some of those worlds never learned that it was safe to be wrong and still somehow be loved.